Some places are better left alone. Each of these locations carries a dark, haunting history, a place where whispers in the dark call your name, shadows seem alive, and those who dare to enter often don't return the same, if they return at all. From the crumbling halls of a forgotten asylum to a forest that screams in the dead of night, from a cursed bridge to a motel room that watches your every move, and a church that hides unspeakable secrets, you'll discover why these places are not meant to be visited, especially alone. What would you do if you found yourself in the heart of such terror? Story 1. The Whispering Asylum. I didn't believe the stories about Greystone Asylum until the whispers started calling my name. It began with a dare. Jamie, our self-proclaimed brave one, wouldn't stop bragging about how he'd spent the night in Greystone Asylum years ago without so much as a scratch. He wasn't scared of ghosts, curses, or shadows. So when I called his bluff and asked if he'd do it again, he smirked. "Why should I? I already proved my point," he said. "Because I don't believe you," I shot back. That's when the others joined in, egging me on. "If you don't believe him, why don't you do it?" Lisa teased. It was a trap, of course. I was the skeptic, the one who laughed off their ghost stories and tales of paranormal nonsense. If I said no, they'd never let me live it down. And if I said yes, well, I wasn't about to back down. By the end of the night, we'd struck a deal. I'd spend one night in the asylum alone, record everything, and prove once and for all that the stories were nothing more than campfire tales. $50 was on the line, just enough to make it worth my time. I arrived at the asylum just before midnight. The drive itself had been unsettling, with my GPS refusing to cooperate and the winding dirt road seemingly endless. The building came into view like a ghost rising from the earth, a sprawling, crumbling structure shrouded in mist. The main gate hung open, rusted and creaking in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My phone buzzed. A text from Jamie. "Don't chicken out, man. We're waiting for that footage." With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight, camera, and a small bag of supplies. The night was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I stepped through the gate, the air seemed to change. Heavier, colder. The building's entrance was wide open, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, the smell hit me first, a nauseating mix of mildew, decay, and something metallic. The faint beam of my flashlight revealed a grand lobby, its tiled floor cracked and littered with debris. A rusted wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels slightly askew. I set up my camera on a tripod, panning it across the room. "All right," I muttered to myself, "let's get this over with." As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The asylum's walls were covered in graffiti and strange markings, some crude, others intricate, almost ritualistic. Greystone Asylum had been shut down in the 1960s after a string of unexplained deaths among its patients. Officially, it was blamed on neglect and poor living conditions, but the locals whispered darker theories. Experiments gone wrong, a doctor who dabbled in the occult, and patients who simply vanished. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. Old patient files littered the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle. One file caught my eye. It was a medical chart for a patient named Eleanor Briggs. The last note read, "Transferred to Ward C unresponsive. Whispers incoherent phrases." I shivered and stuffed the file into my bag, hoping it would make for a good story later. It was around 1 a.m. when I heard the first whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind slipping through the broken windows, but then I realized it wasn't random. It was a voice, soft, indistinct, and coming from somewhere deeper in the building. I froze, straining to listen. My heart pounded in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I told myself it was my imagination and pressed on, though my footsteps suddenly felt too loud in the suffocating stillness. The voice returned a few minutes later, this time clearer. It wasn't words exactly, more like the low murmur of someone just out of earshot. It was coming from Ward C. Ward C was at the far end of the asylum, past a series of hallways that seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The door to the ward was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and groaning as I pushed it open. The room was freezing. My breath puffed out invisible clouds, though it was a humid summer night outside. The walls here were different, covered in scratches, symbols, and writing so frantic it overlapped in layers. One phrase repeated over and over again, "They're watching." My flashlight flickered. I cursed under my breath, smacking it against my palm. That's when I heard it, a voice clear as day, whispering my name. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The room felt wrong, as though the walls were closing in around me. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but it caught only shadows. In the center of the room was a single hospital bed, its mattress stained and sagging. On the bed was a small leather-bound notebook. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The pages were filled with scrawled writing, names, dates, and chilling phrases like, "The voices won't stop and they're inside my head." On the last page, my blood ran cold. My name was written there, over and over in the same frantic hand. The whispers grew louder, no longer indistinct murmurs, but distinct voices. They overlapped, creating a chaotic, dissonant symphony. Some begged, some cried, and others laughed, a high, manic sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled out of Ward C, desperate to leave, but the asylum had changed. The hallways seemed unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. My flashlight's beam barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the shadows seemed to move just out of reach. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Spinning around, I saw nothing, but the whispers were right there, inches from my ears. "Leave. Run. You shouldn't be here." I ran. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the endless hallways. The shadows were no longer subtle. They darted across the walls and ceiling, their shapes grotesque and distorted. Ahead, the main lobby came into view. Relief flooded me as I saw the faint glow of moonlight through the broken windows. But just as I reached the exit, the shadows surged forward, blocking my path. I screamed, swinging my flashlight wildly. The beam illuminated their faces, or what should have been faces. They were hollow, featureless voids, and yet I could feel their gaze piercing through me. With a final burst of adrenaline, I pushed through them, the cold searing my skin like frostbite. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air under the night sky. I reached my car, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The asylum's windows were dark, but I swore I saw figures standing there, watching me leave. When I got home, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was static, warped beyond recognition. But one clip remained clear, a moment in Ward C, just before I ran. In the corner of the frame, there was a figure standing behind me, tall, dark, and impossible. I never went back to Greystone Asylum. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Story 2. The Screaming Forest. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip. Then the screaming began. The trip was Jamie's idea. He'd always been the outdoorsy one, dragging the rest of us out on hikes, kayaking trips, and weekend camping getaways. This time, he'd found a spot so remote it didn't even appear on Google Maps. "No tourists, no noise, no Wi-Fi," he said, grinning like it was a prize. The place was called Wraithwood Forest. The name alone should have been a warning. Jamie, of course, laughed off the local stories. Supposedly, people heard screaming in the woods late at night. high-pitched and desperate, like someone begging for their life. The locals called it the forest that cries. Some said it was the spirits of people who'd gotten lost and died there. Others claimed the forest itself was alive, feeding on fear. I didn't believe any of it. None of us did. It was just a scary story to add to the trip. Or so we thought. We arrived just before sunset. The forest was massive, with ancient trees whose branches twisted like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy and still, almost suffocating. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our boots. Jamie led the way, using a hand-drawn map he'd gotten from some old man in the nearby town. The man had warned him to stay out of the forest after dark. "Once the screaming starts, it's too late," he'd said. Jamie laughed it off, calling it local flavor. We found a small clearing by a creek and set up our tents. The evening passed uneventfully, cooking hot dogs over a campfire, joking about who would cry first if we actually heard screaming. None of us were scared. Not yet. It started around 2 a.m. I woke up to what sounded like distant cries. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a coyote. But as I listened, I realized it sounded human, a long, drawn-out wail that echoed through the trees. I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The others were awake too, their faces pale in the moonlight. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered. Jamie shrugged. "Probably just some animal. Go back to sleep." But we didn't. The screaming continued, rising and falling in the distance. It didn't sound like a single person. It sounded like dozens of voices overlapping, all crying out in pain. By dawn, the screaming had stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The next day, we decided to explore the forest. Jamie led the way, still grinning like this was all part of the adventure. "Let's see if we can find the source of the screams," he joked. About an hour into the hike, we stumbled upon the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of an old oak tree, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a sunburst. The carving was deep, the edges blackened as if burned into the wood. "What the hell is that?" Lisa asked, running her fingers over the grooves. Jamie shrugged. "Probably just some kids messing around." But as we went deeper, we found more symbols on trees, rocks, even the ground. They were all variations of the same pattern, some more intricate than others. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed wrong. The air was colder, the light dimmer, even though it was the middle of the day. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the trees seemed to lean closer together as if they were listening. That night, the screaming returned. This time, it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the clearing. Jamie grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "I'm gonna check it out," he said. "Are you crazy?" Lisa hissed. "You don't just walk toward screaming in the middle of the night." But Jamie was already heading toward the trees. Against my better judgment, I followed him. Lisa stayed behind, muttering curses under her breath. We didn't have to go far. About 20 feet into the woods, Jamie froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his flashlight shaking. I followed the beam of light. At first I thought it was just a tree, but then it moved. It was a figure, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us. "Run," Jamie whispered. We bolted back to the campsite, panting and shaking. But when we got there, Lisa was gone. We spent hours calling her name, searching the surrounding woods with our flashlights. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Eventually, we found her flashlight near one of the carved symbols, its beam flickering weakly. There was no sign of Lisa. "Maybe she went back to the car," Jamie said, though his voice lacked conviction. Through the forest, at night, without her flashlight, I snapped. We returned to the campsite, hoping she'd come back on her own. But by morning, there was still no sign of her. The next day, the forest felt different, darker, denser. It was as if the trees had shifted overnight, closing in around us. Jamie's map was useless now. The landmarks we'd passed the day before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. Panic set in. We tried to retrace our steps, but every path led us deeper into the woods. The symbols were everywhere now, etched into nearly every tree we passed. And then the screaming started again. This time it was deafening, surrounding us from all sides. It wasn't just screaming, it was sobbing, pleading, laughing. The voices overlapped, creating a cacophony that made my ears ring. Jamie dropped his flashlight and clutched his head. "Make it stop!" he yelled. I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "We have to keep moving." As we ran, I saw them, figures darting between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. They were tall and thin, their movements unnaturally fast and jerky. One of them stepped into our path, its face still obscured, but now I could see its eyes, dark, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. Jamie screamed and veered off the path. I chased after him, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every turn leading to more trees, more symbols, more shadows. I don't know how long we ran, hours, days. The screaming never stopped, and the figures never stopped following us. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing. The air was thinner here, lighter. Ahead, I saw a dirt road, the one we'd driven in on. "Jamie!" I yelled, but there was no response. I turned back toward the forest, but it was silent now. The screaming had stopped, and the shadows were gone. I ran to the car and jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. When the engine roared to life, I didn't look back. I drove straight to the police station. They organized a search party, but they didn't find Jamie. They didn't find Lisa. In fact, they didn't find anything, not even our campsite. When I told them about the screaming, the symbols, and the shadow figures, they gave me that look, the one people give you when they think you're crazy. I haven't been back to Wraithwood Forest, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it, the faint echo of screams carried on the wind. Story 3. The Forgotten Church. Opening hook. I found the church by accident. What I found inside still haunts me. It was supposed to be a quick drive. I had left work later than usual, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time I hit the highway. My GPS claimed the route was the fastest way home, but as I turned off onto a narrow, unpaved road, I started to have doubts. The road wound through dense woods, the kind of place where your headlights barely penetrate the darkness. My phone had no signal, and the occasional rustle in the trees made me grip the wheel tighter. I was almost convinced I'd taken a wrong turn when I saw it. The silhouette of a church, its spire barely visible against the night sky. I don't know what compelled me to stop. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the eerie beauty of the building. It was old, with weathered stone walls and a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. A cracked wooden sign hung crookedly near the entrance. The letters were faded, but I could just make out the name, Hallowed Grace Chapel. I parked my car on the side of the road and grabbed my flashlight. Just a quick look, I told myself. Something about the place felt off, but I brushed it aside. I wasn't superstitious. The wooden door groaned loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. My flashlight swept over the interior, revealing rows of crumbling pews, a shattered stained glass window, and a dilapidated altar. As I moved closer, I noticed strange carvings on the back of the pews. They weren't religious symbols, at least not any I recognized. Circles, jagged lines, and runes were etched deeply into the wood, as if someone had carved them in a frenzy. My unease grew as I approached the altar. A large, blackened Bible lay open, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The words were faded, but scrawled in red ink across the margins were phrases like, "He is here," and "The Watcher sees all." I ran my hand over the surface of the altar, which was rough and uneven, almost as if something had been carved into it. As my flashlight beam passed over the surface, I froze. There was a name scratched into the wood. My name. A chill ran down my spine. "Okay, time to leave," I muttered, but as I turned to head back toward the door, I heard it. Faint singing. It was soft, almost like a lullaby coming from somewhere deeper in the church. My flashlight flickered as I moved toward the source of the sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The singing stopped. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but my legs carried me forward. I reached a narrow door at the back of the church, its paint peeling and hinges rusted. Slowly, I pushed it open. The small room beyond was a stark contrast to the rest of the church. Candles lined the walls, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. Strange symbols were painted on the floor in what looked like dried blood, and in the center of the room was a makeshift altar made of stone. On the altar was a photograph. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. It was a picture of me, standing next to my car. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking. "This isn't possible," I whispered. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me with only the faint glow of the candles. Then I heard them, whispers, dozens of them, overlapping and coming from every direction. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was urgent, insistent, and filled with malice. "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning around. My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they weren't coming from the room. They were coming from inside my head. "Leave, stay, repent, die." The words pounded in my skull, relentless and overwhelming. I stumbled backward, clutching my head, until I tripped over something and fell hard onto the cold stone floor. When I looked up, I saw it. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure shrouded in shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and a face that was nothing but a void. Its presence was suffocating, and I couldn't look away. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the figure itself. "Why have you come here?" it asked. My throat was dry, and my voice barely came out as a whisper. I didn't mean to." The figure tilted its head as if studying me. "You have seen too much," it said, its voice echoing in the room. "You do not belong." I scrambled to my feet, my back pressed against the wall. "I'll leave," I stammered. "I'll go right now." The figure didn't move, but the door creaked open slowly behind me. I didn't need any more encouragement. I bolted out of the room, the photograph still clutched in my hand. The whispers returned, louder than before, echoing through the church like a storm. The pews seemed to shift and move as I ran, blocking my path and forcing me to weave through them. The door to the outside was just ahead, but no matter how fast I ran, it never seemed to get closer. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the door, it slammed shut in my face. I pounded on it, screaming, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the whispers stopped again. The silence was deafening, and I turned around, my back pressed against the door. The figure was gone. The church was empty. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed on the door again. This time, it swung open easily. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, and sprinted to my car. When I looked back, the church was dark and still, as if nothing had happened. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached home. My hands were still shaking as I pulled the photograph from my pocket. It had changed. Now the picture showed me standing in the doorway of the church, the shadowy figure looming behind me. I burned the photo that night, but it didn't help. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear faint singing. and in the corner of my eye I see shadows that don't belong. Story 4. The Motel Room That Watched. Opening hook. The moment I stepped into room 213, I felt like someone was watching me. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I had planned it for weeks, a solo drive across the state, stopping at scenic overlooks, small diners, and little motels along the way. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey, but that night, things didn't go as planned. I was running late, way behind schedule thanks to a flat tire earlier in the day. By the time I pulled into the town of Ridgeview, it was close to midnight. The motel was the only place with a vacancy. The neon sign buzzed faintly as I parked in front of the office, the word vacancy flickering like it might give out at any moment. The man at the front desk was strange. He had a gaunt face, hollow cheeks, and eyes that didn't seem to blink. "One night?" he asked, his voice dry and rasping. "Yeah, just passing through," I replied. He slid a key across the counter without another word. It was an old-fashioned metal key attached to a plastic tag that read 213. The man's hand lingered on the key for a moment, and his lips twitched as if he wanted to say something. Instead, he gave me a tight smile and turned away, disappearing into the back room. I shook off the uneasy feeling and made my way to room 213. The room was unsettling. It wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the dim, flickering overhead light. It wasn't the faint smell of mildew that seemed to cling to the air. It was the feeling, a heaviness that pressed against my chest the moment I walked in. The room was small, just a bed, a nightstand, a desk, and a closet. A single window faced the parking lot, the curtains drawn tightly shut. I tossed my bag onto the bed and tried to shrug off the discomfort. It was just a room. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. It started with a knock. I had been lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, soft, hesitant, coming from the wall behind the headboard. I froze, my phone still in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost as if someone were tapping out a pattern. I turned on the bedside lamp and stared at the wall, half expecting to see something burst through, but the room was silent. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes or the old building settling. Still, sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I decided to take a closer look at the room. Something about it didn't feel right, and I couldn't leave without at least trying to figure out what was bothering me. The first thing I noticed was the dresser. One of the drawers wouldn't close properly, so I opened it and froze. Inside were old, faded photographs. They were Polaroids, all of them slightly warped with age. Each photo was taken in the room. Some showed the bed, others the desk or the window. But in every picture there was a figure standing in the corner. The figure was blurry, almost like a smudge on the film, but it was unmistakably human. I shoved the photos back into the drawer and slammed it shut, my heart racing. "It's just a coincidence," I muttered, trying to convince myself. That night, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I had left the lights on, hoping it would help. It didn't. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, stretching along the walls in ways that didn't make sense. Around midnight, the knocking started again, but this time it wasn't just the wall. It came from the window, the closet, the door, all at once. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam around the room. It caught something in the corner, a dark shape that disappeared as soon as the light hit it. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I whispered, but there was no response. Then, from the closet, I heard the faint sound of breathing. I approached the closet slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible between the frame and the door. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. With a deep breath, I yanked it open. The closet was empty, but scratched into the inside of the door were words, "Get out." The letters were jagged and uneven, as if carved in a hurry. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But it was late, and I was exhausted. Just one more night, I told myself. Then I'll go. I didn't sleep. The knocking was relentless now, coming from all directions. The shadows in the room no longer tried to hide. I could see them shifting just out of reach, their shapes unnatural and wrong. And then, at 3 a.m., I heard it, a voice low and guttural, coming from beneath the bed. "You shouldn't have stayed." I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was calm, almost conversational, but it sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my bag and ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the shadows closed in. The air was freezing, so cold it burned my skin. My vision blurred as the shadows pressed closer, their forms twisting and merging into something monstrous. With a burst of adrenaline, I threw open the door and stumbled into the parking lot. The air outside was warm and still, a stark contrast to the icy terror inside the room. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine roared to life, I peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. I never returned to Ridgeview, and I don't think I ever will. A few weeks later, I decided to do some digging. It turns out room 213 has a history. Over the years, multiple guests have reported strange occurrences, knocking, shadows, voices. Some even claimed to see a figure standing in the corner of the room. And then there were the disappearances, people who checked into room 213 and were never seen again. I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up feeling like I'm back in that room. The shadows creeping closer, the voice whispering from beneath the bed. And every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear a faint knock. Story 5. The Bridge That Calls Your Name. Opening hook. They say if you hear your name on Hollow Creek Bridge, you're never seen again. It was our last summer together before we all went our separate ways. College, jobs, and adulthood loomed over us, so my friends and I decided to make the most of the time we had left. One night, after hours of aimless driving and small-town boredom, Jamie suggested we visit Hollow Creek Bridge. The bridge wasn't far, just on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods and a shallow, stagnant creek. Everyone knew the legend. They said if you stood on the bridge at midnight, you might hear your name whispered in the wind. If you did, you were cursed. Most versions of the story ended the same way. The person vanished, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of their name. It was just a story, or at least that's what we told ourselves. We arrived at the bridge just before midnight. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of the creek below. The bridge itself was old, its wooden planks creaking under our weight as we stepped onto it. Jamie, always the brave one, was the first to speak. "All right, who's going first?" Lisa laughed nervously. "What, are we supposed to just wait here until something creepy happens?" "It's just a story," I said, though my voice sounded less confident than I'd hoped. "We'll wait a few minutes, then we can all laugh about how nothing happened." The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the bridge. The creek below was barely visible, a dark, sluggish ribbon of water winding through the woods. We stood there for what felt like forever, shivering in the cool night air. Jamie leaned over the edge of the bridge, staring down at the water. "You guys hear that?" he asked suddenly. Lisa rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, don't start." "No, seriously," Jamie insisted. "It's like someone's calling my name." I froze. The woods were silent, no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing, just the faint sound of water trickling beneath the bridge. "Jamie," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "Stop messing around." "I'm not," he snapped. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "I'm telling you, I heard it." We all laughed nervously, brushing it off as Jamie trying to scare us. But then I heard it too, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, like it was carried on the breeze, but I recognized it instantly. It was my name. My chest tightened and I spun around, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled tree trunks and hanging moss, but nothing else. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Lisa said, looking around anxiously. "My name," I said. "I swear I just heard my name." The tension was palpable now. Jamie was pacing, muttering to himself, while Lisa clung to my arm, her flashlight darting nervously over the trees. "We need to leave," she said. "This isn't funny anymore." Before I could respond, Jamie froze. His flashlight dropped to the ground with a dull thud. "Jamie," I called out, stepping toward him. He didn't answer. He was staring at something in the woods, his face slack with fear. Slowly, he took a step forward, then another, as if in a trance. "Jamie, stop!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. He jerked away, his movements stiff and unnatural, and then without warning, he bolted into the trees. "Jamie!" Lisa screamed, running after him. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding, before following her into the woods. The trees were dense, their branches clawing at my clothes as I pushed through. The ground was uneven, covered in leaves and roots that threatened to trip me with every step. "Jamie!" I yelled again, my voice echoing through the stillness. We searched for what felt like hours, calling his name until our throats were raw. But the deeper we went, the darker and colder it got. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a lone tree, its gnarled branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree was Jamie's flashlight, still on, its beam weak and flickering, but Jamie was nowhere to be found. We returned to the bridge in silence, our nerves frayed. Lisa was crying softly, her face pale and streaked with dirt. I didn't know what to say. Jamie was gone, and I had no explanation. As we stepped onto the bridge, something caught my eye. There was writing on the planks, faint but unmistakable. It hadn't been there before. The words were carved into the wood, jagged and uneven. "He heard his name. Now it's yours." Lisa let out a choked sob. "What does that mean?" I didn't have an answer. We didn't stay long after that. I grabbed Lisa's hand, and we practically ran back to the car. The bridge seemed to watch us as we left, its shadows stretching unnaturally in the moonlight. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound, the hum of the engine. Lisa stared out the window, her eyes hollow. Then she stiffened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I glanced at her. "Hear what?" She turned to me, her face pale. Someone just said my name." We didn't make it far. Lisa insisted we stop, her panic mounting with every mile. I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to get out of here." We pulled into a gas station on the edge of town. It was abandoned, the windows boarded up and the lights flickering weakly. As soon as we stepped out of the car, Lisa froze. Her eyes darted around, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "It's here," she whispered. "What's here?" I asked, my own fear rising. "The voice," she said. "It's calling me." Before I could stop her, Lisa took off running. She disappeared into the darkness, her footsteps fading into the night. I searched for her, screaming her name until my voice gave out. But I knew it was useless. She was gone, just like Jamie. I returned to the car alone, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The bridge had taken them, and then, in the silence, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, and unmistakable. It said my name. I left Ridgeview that night and never looked back. Jamie and Lisa were never found. The police searched the woods and dredged the creek, but there was no trace of them. I don't know what happened on that bridge, and I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night I hear the whisper again, and I wonder how long until it takes me too.